Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The trade war between the US and China has intensified after President Trump went ahead and more than doubled tariffs, a tax on imports, on $200 billion worth of Chinese products. Furniture, car parts, handbags are just some of the consumer goods made in China and imported into the US that will be affected. The US had already levied a 10% tariff on Chinese goods last September, but today that rose to 25%, and Beijing has vowed to retaliate. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel.
A bell can signify celebration, but it also can ring out a warning. And today it felt like the latter, after Donald Trump imposed much higher tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the US and fired out a warning to the world's second biggest economy that he's digging in for the long haul. He tweeted, "Talks with China continue in a very congenial manner. There's absolutely no need to rush, as tariffs are now being paid to the United States by China of 25% on $250 billion worth of goods and products."
President Trump said yesterday that we received another good letter from President Xi. He has a strong relationship. We believe a deal is possible, but what President Trump has made clear is we think we're in a very strong position either way.
The Chinese are in Washington in the hope of concluding a deal. Their lead negotiator said increasing tariffs hurts everyone.
I came here with sincerity in these special circumstances to engage in rational and candid exchanges with the US side. Of course, China believes raising tariffs in the current situation is not a solution to the problem. It will be harmful to China, the United States and to the whole world.
Donald Trump has often been accused of being too trigger-happy when it comes to tariffs, too keen to start a trade war. But on this, significantly, the Democrats are behind him. They're urging him to remain tough. When it comes to trade in China, there's a feeling here that they've been allowed to get away with too much for too long. Until a few days ago, all the mood music was positive. President Xi would come to the US and sign a deal. The two sides were close to agreement, but last weekend, the president accused Beijing of ratting on a deal to open up their market to US goods. In the middle of this are US farmers whose products have been hit by retaliatory tariffs, and they're desperate for a trade deal as soon as possible.
We've almost waited too long. So the only thing that's really going to help us is if he makes a deal and China comes in and they guarantee to buy X amount of bushels.
And US consumers, who are now going to find a range of imports costing way more in the shops. And if this carries on, it'll be the global economy that will suffer. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, let's speak to our China correspondent, John Sudworth, who's in Beijing. And what has been the reaction there, then?
Well, Sophie, China is promising further retaliation. We don't know what form that's going to take yet, but make no mistake about it. These tariffs are further proof that Donald Trump, from Beijing's point of view, is ripping up the rulebook and turning a 40-year policy of further engagement with China into one of open hostility. China does have some cards up its sleeve. Don't forget that these tariffs will hit American consumers just as much as they hit Chinese suppliers. It will make a whole range of goods, things like Chinese-made furniture, Chinese-made electronic goods, vacuum cleaners, things like that, more expensive for your average Trump-voting American. And don't forget, too, that China, of course, doesn't have to worry about the electoral cycle. Donald Trump very much does have to worry about that, so you could argue that he needs a deal, and quicker, and needs a deal more quickly than China needs a deal. This is a seismic recalibration of one of the most important trading and political relations of our time. It'll take about 2 weeks for these tariffs to really kick in, because at the moment they only apply to goods that haven't yet left port. So there's a glimmer of hope there, Sophie. It means there's a 2-week period in which negotiators of both sides can get together now and try to step back from the brink.
John Sudworth, thank you.
Now, President Trump has insisted that trade talks to end the standoff between the US and China are continuing in a very congenial manner, despite having slapped new tariffs on Chinese goods worth £150 billion. Mr. Trump declared the tariffs would make the United States much stronger, as Beijing vowed unspecified countermeasures in response. Our international editor Lindsay Hilson reports from Washington.
Made in China, much to the frustration of the man it promotes, who today imposed more tariffs on Chinese goods, just as the Chinese thought a trade deal was all but done. He, of course, blames them.
We were getting very close to a deal, then they started to renegotiate the deal. We can't have that. We can't have that.
Today, US negotiators waited like nervous bridegrooms, while the Chinese delegation wove through the streets of Washington. They're resisting US demands that any deal be ratified in Chinese law. Everyone's aware that this is just one part of an increasingly troubled relationship between the old and the rising superpower. The Americans have just announced that for security reasons, they'll bar China Mobile from the US telecoms market, just as they've barred Huawei from participating in the new 5G network, and pressured the UK to do the same. What the Chinese say is this is just the Americans wanting to deny market access.
Our markets are more open than any other country's markets in the world. We are responding here purely to a national security concern.
But is there a compromise then which can be done, or is that like that's the end of it? National security, no discussion?
We think this is a purely national security discussion done for purely national security reasons. I just point out the sort of economic disparity between the way that our companies, that is Western companies, are treated in China versus the way that Chinese companies are treated in our open market here in the United States.
Donald Trump likes to portray himself as the hard man of negotiations.
China has total respect for Donald Trump and for Donald Trump's very, very large brain.
But goods which are already at sea will be exempted from the new tariffs, giving at least 2 weeks more time for negotiations. And the president also likes to suggest that his personal relations with President Xi can solve anything.
I did get last night a very beautiful letter from President Xi. Let's work together. Let's see if we can get something done.
US farmers fear that the Chinese will now impose more tariffs on US agricultural products. But the president says the US economy is strong, and anyway, he's the master of the deal. Well, it's pretty windy here today, and they say it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. Certainly that's what President Trump thinks. He tweeted today that if the Chinese put countermeasures more on agricultural products, maybe the US government will buy them and they can use them to help starving nations. Anyway, he said the amount of money they're going to get from these new tariffs would be better than any phenomenal trade deal. Not everyone agrees with that. The stock market's down for the 5th day in a row. One of the trade organizations says that these new tariffs would be passed to consumers, would cost an American family more than $700 per year. Anyway, Donald Trump says, we don't know what's going to happen next. Indeed, we don't.
But you'll tell us. Lindsay, thanks very much.
The worst thing you can possibly do in a deal is seem desperate to make it. That makes the other guy smell blood, and then you're dead. So wrote Donald Trump way back in 1987 in The Art of the Deal, his treatise on how to win in business. Now he's president, and overnight his country's trade talks with China in Washington took a turn for the worse, with the US dramatically increasing tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese exports. Not to be deterred, this evening he hailed his constructive relationship with China. So are tariffs an end in themselves for a president that has flirted with protectionism, or just the kind of negotiating tactic outlined in his book, designed to get China to cave in and reach an agreement? Does tough talk deliver for America, or could it bring a global trade conflict? And if so, what impact might that have on us here in the UK? Here's our economics editor, Ben Chu.
A race against time, albeit a slow one. Donald Trump's latest tariff hikes only apply on Chinese goods shipped from today. Because most US goods imports from China arrive by Pacific Ocean container ship, that gives the two economic superpowers 2 to 4 weeks to do a deal before these levies bite.
Only a dumb bunny would have you remember 1932.
History has a warning. The last time the world saw a general trade war was the 1930s, an era of mass unemployment, soup kitchens, and political chaos. Protectionism compounded the economic misery of the Great Depression. Those are the stakes, and they don't just affect the US and China.
The world is starting to turn inwards. So this wave of globalization that spread through the global economy in the 1990s and 2000s, that's starting to reach its limits, maybe starting to unwind at just the point when the UK is starting to want to do trade deals with countries.
Of course, the talks between the two economic superpowers on what Trump calls a real deal are ongoing. But if this does turn out to be a major escalation of the global trade war, who gets hurt? Trump claims, on Twitter naturally, that hiking US tariffs on Chinese imports damages the Chinese economy and boosts the coffers of the US government. But economists stress that it's actually Americans who bear the lion's share of the cost of these new taxes, in the form of more expensive imports of everything from electronics to toys to clothes.
On one hand, you can listen to Donald Trump. On the other hand, you can look at the economic facts and the evidence that is out there. The tariff revenue is not enough to offset those costs to consumers and producers.
The economics of trade wars is the economics of the madhouse, really. First and foremost, it's not China that pays the tariff, it's the US consumer.
What about the UK? What's the economic impact here? Well, the Bank of England did some economic modelling last year. Assuming a generalised trade war, where everyone raises tariffs on everyone else by around 10%, the estimated cost for the world is 2.5% of output. For the UK, it's just under 2% of our GDP over 3 years. That adds up to £40 billion in today's money, or around £1,500 per UK household. It's important to note that it's not just the cost of the tariffs that cause the pain in the form of lower household consumption and exports. These effects are actually quite small. For the UK, the bulk of the projected harm comes from tighter financial conditions and uncertainty, which leads to lower business investment.
Businesses in general we can call them like a very sensitive animal to the overall conditions in the economy, beyond economic fundamentals, but also to all the risks that are out there. So yes, tariffs and global trade war, for sure, they pose a risk to business confidence.
But what also matters enormously for the UK is the stability of the global trading rules framework, which Donald Trump is assailing.
The direct exposure of the UK to what's happening between the US and China is quite limited, but the key point is that the UK economy itself is relatively open. So what matters in the global economy, what happens in the global economy matters for the UK.
There's evidence the flare-up in global trade hostilities since last year has already dampened the global economy. Now, this may not last, but if it does, expect more economic damage for the world and the UK.
Well, I'm now joined by Dr. Keiyu Jin, an Associate Professor of Economics at LSE, and Clete Williams, a former lead negotiator on trade with China for the White House, who joins us from Washington. And at the end of that report, Benchu took it round, they were talking about the impact on the UK and the US, the UK and the global economy. And earlier today, our political editor sat down with Liam Fox, the Trade Secretary. Have a listen to what he had to say about that.
It can have an impact on the whole global economy, of which we are the 5th biggest economy. And in a trade war, there are never any winners. There are only casualties.
And that was Liam Fox. I mean, would you agree with that, Dr. Jin?
Absolutely. We are not actually even seeing the full effects of the trade war impact because, the world is operating under supply chain. So it's not just China and US, but many, many major countries involved. And of course, the uncertainty to financial conditions, both in the UK, but also China, also the US. We've seen the stock market reactions. This is likely going to continue so long as this issue doesn't get resolved.
And Clete Williams, you've been in those negotiations. Presumably, the global impact isn't at the forefront of your mind, but would you accept that whatever happens, if it's negative, will have a negative impact on the rest of the world?
No, well, thank you for the question. And certainly, we are very focused on how China's unfair trade practices over the years have affected the U.S. economy. But I think what I'd point out at the outset is I wouldn't look at this as a trade war that was initiated by the United States. What I would look at this is there are long-standing practices in China's economy, forced technology transfer, massive industrial subsidies, a lack of intellectual property protection that hurts companies in the U.S., just as it hurts companies in the UK and the broader EU. And I think what the United States has been trying to do is to try to find a resolution to those problems.
And I mean, would you believe that that is it has a greater impact than the impact that they might have as a result of all this protectionism on the rest of the world's economies?
Well, look, I think there's a short-term issue versus a long-term issue here. And I'm not going to deny that in the short term, raising tariffs can have somewhat of an adverse impact on certain businesses, certain consumers in the United States and around the world. There's no question about that from an economic standpoint. But the idea is that if the practices that China has been engaging in go unchecked for too long, that's going to have a significantly negative impact on the global economy. And if ultimately the United States is successful here, and if we can get a deal that opens up China's markets, gets China to play fairly, to play by the rules, that's going to benefit everyone around the world.
And Dr. Jin, do you believe this is the way to deal with China? Do you think the Americans will get a deal as a result of this?
Well, speaking about fair or unfair trade practices, what the U.S. is doing in terms of threatening the tariffs is certainly illegal under the WTO framework. What the U.S. is arguing about or claiming China is doing is much more ambiguous. On joint ventures, on these kind of things, actually China has been following pretty much what was negotiated at the time of the WTO. And if you look at the data, the U.S. has violated twice as many in terms of WTO violations since 2001 than China has since it's joined.
And Clete Williams, what's going on right now? What's going through his head? Is he playing hardball but expecting to get a deal? Is he playing it the way you expected it?
Yeah, well, look, I think what the president is trying to do here is he's trying to get a deal. I think the president recognizes that over the long term, having a deal is going to be good for the United States. It's going to be good for the global economy. But what the president has signaled here is that he's willing to walk away. He's willing to take tough action if it's not the right deal. And there's been a lot of conversation about what is a good deal for the United States. Is it just short-term purchases of U.S. products, or is it something else? And I think what has happened this week is the president has made very clear that what he is interested in getting and what needs to be a part of this deal is structural reforms. So when China started backing down on some of those commitments, that's when this action was taken.
But in putting in these tariffs, I mean, do you see him as an out-and-out protectionist? There were, signs that potentially that was the case during his campaign, for example. Or do you see him more as a sort of believer in free trade who's also just a very hard negotiator?
No, I think it's the latter. And quite frankly, I think what the president would like to see is for the United States and China to compete on a level playing field. That hasn't been happening. And respectfully, I think I would take on the notion that there isn't evidence of China taking advantage of others. And I think if you look at the report that the United States produced to justify its tariff action, it is detailed. It gets into great details of instances of where companies are required to turn over their technology to access the Chinese market. It gets into details on many instances of intellectual property theft. And what the U.S. is doing is responding to that.
And Dr. Jin, do you think, how much of this do you think is actually about trade, and how much is it about two big superpowers jostling for, position in the 21st century?
I think it's not just about trade. Trade is the symptom, and it's potentially the first of many and a long struggle to come about. It is about Chinese aspirations, it is about the Chinese development model, and it's about Chinese technology. I mean, fundamentally, the reason we can't really reach an agreement between these two countries is that there is a gray zone, no-go area, which is how involved should the state be? How advanced should China's technology program be? Kennedy had a huge space program. That was government funded. That was state-led. China has proven to be a very successful economic model because of the state-led growth. And the U.S. is challenging that. And China thinks, well, why do you have a say in how we want to grow?
Well, thank you both so much, Dr. Jin and Clete Williams. Thank you very much for joining us. Of course, Britain has its own trade deals to work out for life after Brexit. And today, the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, was in Iceland, a country with a population more than 1 billion smaller than China's. His focus is negotiating Britain's global role after we leave the EU. But it turns out the real negotiations at the moment are going on at home. With European elections looming, there's consternation from many Tories that their party isn't trumpeting the symbolic issue of an independent post-Brexit trade policy in their election leaflets. And as Dr. Fox told our political editor Nick Watt today, he'll be raising that and his opposition to Theresa May conceding a customs union to the Labour Party at Cabinet.
A world beyond our shores, a visit to a nearish neighbour. With cod wars long forgotten, as Britain's trade envoy-in-chief drums up new opportunities for life after Brexit.
If it's a quiet day at Westminster, then like clockwork, Liam Fox will be on an early morning flight to renew acquaintances that in his eyes have been neglected over the past 45 years. Today, it's the windswept Icelandic capital of Reykjavik. Hardly an economic giant, but a friendly reception nonetheless.
So much for looking after us. Thank you. It's really interesting. Thank you very much indeed.
And a spot of big tent diplomacy. Perhaps the UK would like to follow Iceland out of the customs union, but in the single market through the European Free Trade Association.
We are outside the fisheries policy, we are outside the agriculture policy. We can trade with everyone we want. For example, we have a lot of free trade deals through EFTA. So it's good for us, but it needs a little bit explanation in the UK.
No trade trip will be complete without a chance to road test local products in a picturesque way. A lot of energy expended by a representative of the world's 5th largest economy on an economy outside the top 100.
Iceland is a very important partner for the UK. It's an important NATO partner. It's an important partner potentially in terms of energy security, and of course it's estimated that up to 95% of British fish and chip shops are dependent upon cod and haddock produced by Iceland. So no, there are opportunities everywhere. I was in Iraq a couple of weeks ago, again looking at opportunities for British power generators and British water companies. So it's a constant scouring for where we can find opportunities for British businesses.
You're talking about stepping up no-deal planning. Do you think if the deal hasn't been ratified in Parliament by the end of October, we should just get out of the EU?
Well, that may of course not be our choice, because the EU may decide that it's time for us to leave and that they don't want any further extension beyond that period. We have to be reasonable and prepare for no deal. Countries look at Britain and say, well, are you leaving or are you not? And are you going to get a deal or not? And if you're going to get a deal, why should we invest time and effort on no deal planning? We've got a rather uncomfortable message for them, which is we may have to do the March 29 all over again for October the 31st.
And isn't there a problem for you that status of being sort of frozen from the Brexit impasse, that will continue if the Prime Minister gets her way? Because if she gets her way, there'll be a deal with Labour, and what that would effectively do is effectively keep us in the customs union until the 2022 election, at which point the British people would be asked the Liam Fox approach, complete freedom on trade, or the Labour permanent customs union. But the key thing is effectively in the customs union until the 2022 election.
Well, I think you mustn't make any assumptions either about what is being negotiated or what might be accepted by the Cabinet. I could not, under any circumstances, accept permanent membership of a customs union.
And if the Prime Minister concedes too much to Labour in those talks, would you resign from the Cabinet?
Oh, I've no intentions of losing that argument. I think it's far too important. That's why, for example, I decided to remain in the Cabinet and fight for those elements that I believed in, including that a customs union would not be a good idea for the UK.
So no intention of losing that argument suggests that there is an argument?
Any argument around customs union, I want to be there at the table, making the case for why I believe it's bad for the United Kingdom, and it's certainly not what we voted for in the referendum.
Now, in just under 2 weeks' time, you, a passionate Brexiteer, you're going to have a chance to vote in the European parliamentary elections. It's going to be pretty grim, isn't it?
I wouldn't read too much into these European elections. Voters know that what they actually cast a vote for doesn't really matter in that it won't really affect the governance of the United Kingdom.
So not read a lot into the European elections, but maybe read a lot into the Conservative leaflet for the elections, which has no mention of what I thought was one of the great benefits of Brexit, which is an independent trade policy.
Well, I haven't seen the leaflet, but I would say that it was one of the totemic elements of leaving the European Union, and the Prime Minister has been very clear that an independent trade policy is one of the key asks in this.
So a totemic benefit of Brexit, so perhaps you might be having a word with CCHQ officials to sort of put it in later editions of the leaflet.
Well, I'll certainly be wanting to raise to Cabinet that we retain that as a central plank of our European policy.
A trade mission on the move, but battles loom back home.
I've been getting